want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Our guest today on the enemies list is Ken Block. Ken Block has a great new book out called Disproven, My Unbiased Search for Voter Fraud for the Trump Campaign. The data shows why he lost and how we can improve our elections. And Ken, I want to thank you so very much because there's a lot of noise that triumphs over signal when we end up talking about the 2020 election, because so many people around Donald Trump tend to believe this elaborate idea that the 2020 election was stolen from him, and that somehow random postings on Reddit or on Discord are the same as evidence of some sort of massive conspiracy to steal the election from Donald Trump. Talk to us about your book and about how you reported out, on behalf of the Trump campaign, initially trying to figure out if this was real and coming to the conclusion that it was all made up.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. By the way, you left out the website, the Donald.win, where, if you can believe it,
Yes.
I was told by the Trump attorneys that I reported to, they asked me to go to that website to get the particulars of some of the claims of voter fraud that I was asked to vet. So it's really a pretty wild story. The day after the election, my cell phone rang. It was one of the top campaign attorneys by the name of Alex Cannon. And he was a full-time employee of the campaign. And he called me out of the blue and asked me to help the campaign look for evidence of voter fraud sufficient to change the outcome of an election and, importantly, survive legal scrutiny. And then shortly after I started doing that work, I was then delivered many claims of voter fraud that other people made in all of the craziest places and craziest claims that you can imagine. And I was sent the claims that had at their source data. And I was asked to vet those claims. They wanted to know if they were true or false and whether those claims could underpin a legal challenge to an election result. And the most astonishing thing I'm going to tell you today, and there'll be a bunch of them, but the most astonishing one is that there were Trump campaign attorneys who did their professional due diligence and did the right thing and tried to make sure that claims of fraud that had no foundational basis, in fact, were ignored and worse. So, yeah.
So bifurcate the world of the Trump attorneys for us for a moment. Of the people, the serious people who were professionals and looked at this versus the people that we now see on trial in Georgia, the people that we've now seen, the John Eastmans, the Sidney Powells, the Rudy Giulianis. Talk to us about how those two different worlds collided and intersected in the immediate aftermath of the campaign.
Yeah, so I just want to be careful to state up front that what I'm about to tell you, I did not witness firsthand.
Sure.
A lot of what I'm about to tell you, I was able to piece together by reading the January 6th depositions and then applying what I learned there to what I did in the month of November 2020. I processed claims that were sponsored by John Eastman, by Sidney Powell, and Cleta Mitchell. These claims, when they came to me, were pretty thoroughly washed. I didn't know where they came from and who sponsored them. But I now know, for example, that John Eastman was behind a claim of 16,000 claimed duplicate votes cast in Nevada, that Sidney Powell was behind a very complex application of a mathematical theory in Pennsylvania that claimed to show that the statewide election was fraudulent, and it just went on and on all the way to this claim on the Donald.win. The two camps of lawyers were at war with each other. Now, I didn't know that at the time, but I learned that through the January 6th deposition transcripts. And the lawyer that I reported to, Alex Cannon, said under oath, as he was being asked about Cleta Mitchell in particular, he was asked whether he interacted with her, and his answer was no, he avoided her at all costs because she was attacking him at every turn. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he said.
Full disclosure, folks, Cleta was once my campaign and elections attorney for many, many years before she went, like so many people, over to the dark side. So tell us a little bit more about the Donald.win and some of these other online forums. A lot of these people seem to be using the sort of MAGA ecosystem where they would find something crazy online, send it to a friend of Don Jr. or Eric or some other Trump, somebody in the Trump orbit, and then it would sort of get percolated up to Donald Trump, and he would go and say, "This is proven. It was on the internet. It must be real," and go pursue it. Right? I mean, tell us a little bit about how that ecosystem of misinformation worked to impact the things you were ended up being assigned to look at.
So, without a doubt, the most insane claim that I was asked to take a look at was a claim that came out of Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. It was one of the last things I did for the campaign in early December 2020. Cannon, when he sent me the email asking me to look into this claim, indicated that it had a high priority. And interestingly, he didn't really wash it. So I had the whole chain of emails from source all the way delivered to me. So it tells a very interesting story. The claim was that more than 700,000 folks in Wisconsin illegally voted twice. And the people who did the analysis were self-described volunteers, and that the particulars of the claim could be found on the Donald.win. They were very excited. They wanted the Department of Justice to swoop in and start arresting people by the thousands. They delivered the claim to a friend of theirs who played golf, who brought the claim to the manager of a Trump golf course, who delivered the claim to Eric Trump, who, by the way, and I'm going to pause here in the chain and say up front that Eric Trump and Jared Kushner, I found out after I was finished doing the work, were identified in the January 6th transcripts as being the two who were responsible for the purse strings for the work that I was doing. So the claim got delivered to Eric Trump, who delivered it to Alex Cannon, who gave it to me. And when he gave it to me, he said, "Tell me why this is wrong." So we had traveled a long way, Alex and I, over the 35 days in which we had done this work. And he started by asking me to tell him whether the claims were right or wrong. And by the end of it, every time he asked me, it was, "Tell me why this one is wrong. Tell me why this one is wrong." It's remarkable that this insane claim that at its foundation was just a gigantic misunderstanding and lack of understanding by the people who did the work originally, found its way essentially to the Oval Office, to my desk, and was considered a high priority item to vet. And that's the mania that was happening in November of 2020. You had people from every walk of life trying as hard as they could to find the smoking gun that proved the claims of voter fraud were true. And people were doing heroic work trying to come up with the proof. And the problem is that the legally allowable proof that showed that massive voter fraud occurred did not exist in November of 2020, and to this day still does not exist.
So tell us a little bit about your background and why you were a person that they called in to do this work. I know that they were throwing money at the problem. They thought they could solve it. So tell us a little bit about your background and I mean, they contracted with you because you know what you're talking about when it comes down to this stuff.
Yeah. So I am a database engineering professional. I own a software engineering company. I have built really large, complicated, mission-critical systems over the years. Mm-hmm. We've done a lot of work with the lottery industry. I helped design the country's first online food stamp debit card system for the state of Texas. It's called the Lone Star card. That system is still in use. I'm credited with helping the state of Texas save more than $1 billion of waste and fraud because of the use of that system and the work that we did analyzing different places where there was either fraudulent activity happening or dollars to be saved. So that's in my background. I'm a 2-time candidate for governor in Rhode Island.
Okay.
The first time I ran as the sacrificial candidate for a new political party that I had created, a centrist political party that I unfortunately decided to call the Moderate Party. Nobody understood it. But I ran because in Rhode Island, aside from collecting 35,000 signatures, which is a monumental effort in this small little state, I had the new party's gubernatorial candidate had to win 5% of the vote to keep the party alive. And if had I not done that, the party would have disappeared. So as a nobody, unknown candidate, over the course of 8 months, I did very well in the debates and took 6.5% in the election, achieving the goal of keeping the party alive. Right. In 2014, I abandoned the party. I ran for governor as a Republican because it was too hard to raise money. Nobody got it. There's a lot of challenges with third parties that are foundational, right? We have a lot of laws that disadvantage any real competition to the Democrats and Republicans, and it just wasn't worth fighting that fight anymore. So I ran as a Republican. I lost my primary by 3,000 votes, and voter fraud wasn't to blame. So that's the background. After that loss, I started looking at voter data, mostly because I wanted to understand what votes I left on the table. How did I end up short 3,000 votes in my race? And as I got into it and began looking at it in Rhode Island, I saw a lot of deficiencies with what Rhode Island had inside its voter rolls. And then I began playing with voter data in many different states as a training tool for the engineers who work for me, because I frequently give them projects to just work on large sets of data and look for things. And we did that. And we began to see that there were folks, for example, who lived in Newport, Rhode Island, who were also voting in Palm Beach, Florida. And we could prove it 100% by looking at real estate records and other types of things like that. So began to do that. And this is what's important to understand is 2014, we were only 8 years into having nationwide computerized voter files. Right. So before that, no one really was doing this up to this point in time. And I quickly went from looking at a few files to looking at 42 states across the country. I developed a reputation. I already had a reputation of knowing what I'm doing in the industry generally. And as I began looking at voter data, I began finding things, getting things fixed in Rhode Island, applying what we learned to other places. And I developed a reputation for being accurate, being thorough, and knowing what I was doing with voter data. Now, how the campaign directly came to me, I'm still unsure. And I, believe it or not, I haven't actually spoken to Alex since 2020. We traded a few text messages as the book was coming out. He asked for an autographed copy, and I happily sent it to him. Mm-hmm. I didn't have the time when we were doing all this crazy work to ask him how he found his way to me, so I don't want to conjecture on that. I'm actually happy that he did. It was a unique opportunity to, with virtually unlimited funds and with the data collection expertise of the Republican National Committee, I was able to undertake what in effect was an audit of a national election, which I don't think anybody has done before.
And again, the audit of this national election, this sweeping analysis, this gigantic math and statistical and data effort ended up not proving what Trump world wanted it to prove. So as you became sort of a bearer of bad news for them, how did that relationship evolve as you started to say, this is not true, this, you can't prove this, the math isn't there, there's no chain of custody on these records that would demonstrate that, what they're saying is not statistically possible? How did your relationship with them start to devolve or evolve as you became somebody who wasn't telling them what they wanted to hear?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer to it arises in the negotiation that I held with Alex before I signed the contract. In a decade of looking at voter data, I had never seen anything that came close to what I knew the Trump campaign needed me to find. And I wanted to make sure that both Alex and anybody above him understood that I wasn't promising a specific set of results, that if it was there, I would find it. But if it wasn't there, I wasn't going to deliver a custom ordered set of results that weren't true.
Right.
And when I told Alex that, he immediately said, that's exactly what I want. We want a straight up assessment. And then he told me, and to make sure that you don't have undue political pressure brought on you, we will make sure that your identity remains unknown to the people above him. And so that I was able to perform the straight up assessment that we did. As I gave Alex on a daily basis, bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news, he never once leaned on me. He never once indicated what the heck. And what I now know because of the January 6th deposition transcripts, he took the totality of my findings, which was there was no fraud. He brought them to Mark Meadows, ran him through everything. And Mark Meadows' response, Mark Meadows was Trump's chief of staff at the time.
Sure.
Mark Meadows' response to hearing that the campaign looked and did its due diligence and found no evidence of fraud sufficient. There was some fraud, but not enough to matter. Not enough fraud to change an election result, and that every other claim of fraud that we looked at was false. Meadows' response to that was, well, that means there's no there, meaning that the claims of voter fraud had nothing in them. And then news reports in the Washington Post tell us that Mark Meadows told Jack Smith's investigators that he took that message and delivered it to Trump.
So you never interacted with Trump directly. You never dealt with Donald Trump one-on-one on this. Am I correct in that?
That's correct. Almost all of my dealings were with Alex Cannon by design.
Okay. And as this madness evolved into more and more sweeping insanity, frankly, they ended up putting themselves in legal peril in Georgia in particular, but also in the federal examinations. And if you can tell us where things stand and what you've heard in terms of like the Georgia case in particular, because that seems to have been the one that drew in a lot of the Trump attorneys who were pushing so much of this false information.
Yeah. Well, let me start with my role in these different legal matters. I am the recipient of 3 different subpoenas from 3 different legal actions. The first one was a phone call from the FBI on behalf of Jack Smith, where I received a subpoena for all of my communications with the Trump campaign in 2020 that related to the election and my work.
Okay.
Handed all that over. And that was a pretty closely held secret until the Washington Post broke the story that I received the subpoena. And shortly after that story broke, my doorbell rang and I was served a subpoena by Ruby Freeman's legal team, asking me for information about anything I did that related to either her or Rudy Giuliani. And I really didn't have anything. That claim, for those who are wondering why I didn't have anything, the defamation suit against Giuliani, his claim about Ruby Freeman's actions were straight up hearsay. They were lies, actually. Giuliani admitted that they were lies. They had no basis in voter data, so that anything that related to Ruby Freeman or any kind of claim like that never came to me. It was only data that I looked at. So that I couldn't really help them, and they were very understanding, and they went on their way. And then my cell phone rang again, and it was an investigator who was a member of Fonnie Willis's legal team in Fulton County, and I received a subpoena for all the same information I gave to Jack Smith. So all that stuff all of my work is delivered to these investigations. They have them. Okay. I don't know what they're doing with them. I haven't heard from either of those legal actions since I delivered the information.
Okay.
And my sense is that everything's kind of on hold, and we're wait and see. Will I be a witness in these cases? I don't have to be. I'm a fact witness. The communications speak for themselves.
Right.
And they're all covered in the book, by the way. Okay. And every one of them was not true, not true, not true. And well, we found a half dozen dead votes in name the state, but nowhere close to the thousands claimed. So yeah.
And this is something I've written about this before, and as a former political hack, I've always told people, like, voter fraud is a problem at the edges and margins. This is not something that is systemic and widespread. Explain to people why it's hard to engage in massive voter fraud statistically and mathematically and logistically, if you can.
Well, because as long as the U.S. remains non-internet based voting, it's actually very hard to commit massive voter fraud, to generate even 1,000 fraudulent votes, let alone 10,000 or 100,000. You have to, if you're going to do it by mail, you need to make 10,000 mail ballot or 100,000 mail ballot requests to a different address. All those requests have to be received, signed. You have to have an active voter registration against which to request that mail ballot application. All the information you fill out, including, in theory, your signature, has to go back to election authorities, has to be vetted, approved, and then they're going to mail out a live ballot to you at the address that you indicated, at which time you would then again have to sign your name, do all kinds of things, cast the vote, mail it back in, and then in theory you've committed one act of voter fraud. But now multiply that effort times thousands or hundreds of thousands. It's an awful lot of work that would require many different addresses, signature matching, where signature matching is happening effectively. It's actually very difficult to do. It's easy to do in a singleton case. And in fact, I predicted a few cases of deceased voters casting a fraudulent vote before they happened. I saw some voters who received a registration in September of 2020 who had been dead for years, who applied for a mail ballot app, who first of all were given a live registration. They requested a mail ballot application. They received it. They filled it out. They sent it in. They were approved to be a permanent mail ballot recipient. So had they not been caught, they would have received a ballot every election automatically. A fraudulent vote was sent in. This was all part of a court case I was involved with in 2020, not part of the campaign. It was entered into evidence. The day that the judge heard oral arguments about this particular case, ironically, is the day that the fraudulent vote was received by election authorities and counted. And after the fact, this is in Pennsylvania, the fraudulent vote counted. The voter registration was canceled because the voter was determined to be deceased after the fact. There was an investigation. The guy who committed the fraud was charged. He pled guilty. And, it was not hard for him to do in a singleton circumstance. But it would be very, very difficult to get an army of people to do the same thing.
Right. And I can tell you from some experience I had way back in the day. Miami used to be sort of a hotbed for, everybody living in one house would end up sort of giving their absentees to whoever the local guy was. That was like what party machine stuff. But even then, it was very, very difficult. It was very, very difficult for anyone to get that up at scale where it made a difference at scale. And because you can't scale these things, it really does change the likelihood of it becoming something that was, meaningful in numbers. So let me ask you one last question here, and then we'll let you get on your way. And thank you again for coming on the Enemies List today. What was it in writing this book and in this experience that surprised you the most about what happened in your story?
So I can't answer that question from the mindset of while it was happening. It was too chaotic and we were under the gun the whole time. I couldn't be retrospective about anything during that time period. As I've reflected on it, as I wrote the book and dredged up all these memories and thought about it, there were a couple of things that were truly remarkable. And maybe the biggest one to me, and the one I just can't put my head around and I can't understand, is how successful individuals with lots of professional achievements, prominent in their industries, why? What would motivate them to sacrifice everything in pursuit of the claim, proving the claim that massive voter fraud caused Trump's loss? Why would they throw everything away in service of election denialism? That's one big one. Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting and depressing to me that we're seeing this happen through not just one person. We're seeing many, many people who did this same thing. The other thing, and maybe this is even bigger because I think it's a much bigger problem in general, is that the two sets of media that we now have in this country, conservative and liberal, is a monumental problem and makes all of this election denialism stuff that we're dealing with right now and many other things possible. And I'm going to give you a real life example that just happened to me. So for all of the media coverage I've gotten for this book, and I've had a lot, none of it has been in conservative media, which no one will be surprised at.
Not shocked.
In the Federalist, which is a highbrow conservative website, a data analyst of sorts in Georgia wrote a hit piece that he had published on the Federalist. It was full of half truths and non-truths, and it was just a hit job. And I asked the Federalist if they would entertain a rebuttal, and the answer was, send it along and we'll take a look. So I spent a week writing a very carefully worded, here's the real story behind all of this. Here's where the guy involved stopped his narrative, and had he gone one sentence further, he would show that I was right. So I went through the whole thing. They didn't publish my response.
Of course not.
Right. And so they wouldn't let me set the record straight. And they're not the only conservative publication that has rejected opinion pieces that I've written, and everything. I can't get the facts that I lived with, that I have had to turn over under oath, published. And so there are tens of millions of people who are being programmed to believe, and this includes some dear friends of mine, who have been programmed to believe that voter fraud is the only way this election was lost by Trump, when they're not given any facts to contradict or to even consider to help them make a more informed decision about things. Until we fix that problem, I think we're largely screwed.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Well, Ken Block, thank you so much for coming on the enemies list today, folks. The book is Disproven by Ken Block. It is a great analysis of the 2020 panic in Trump world, trying to find the way to disprove the election, and they failed. Anyway, thanks again, Ken, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Terrific. Thank you.
Hey, Matt Gaetz, stop being such an asshole. I mean it. Matt went out and voted, of course, as one of the handful of people in the House who voted against the resolution against anti-Semitism. And explaining it on Twitter, he used an anti-Semitic trope about the Jews killing Christ. Read your goddamn history, Matt. CF the Romans. This thing is one of the things that Matt, he sort of drifted down the food chain a little bit now that Kevin McCarthy's called him an open pedophile in the MAGA world. But this idea of pure transgression for the sake of pure transgression, it's not conservative. It's not independent. It's not some sort of iconoclastic brilliance. It's just being a dick. And if you want to be an anti-Semitic dick, well, that's on you. But as long as you do, you'll remain on the enemies list.